I'm very grateful to Professor Malakian for inviting me to address this conference. The occasion on which I'm speaking, I'm recording this statement in January, although the conference is going to take place in March. And so there have recently been very frightening events involving conflict between our two countries. But at the moment, the threat of escalation to a fuller conflict seems to have subsided, and both sides are pulling back from a confrontation after an exchange of violent acts. I hope that this truce or pause in conflict will continue until the time of the conference when you will be actually hearing these remarks. It is a very disturbing situation, and it makes all the more important the consideration by all of you of the question of peace between nations and the conditions that may lead to it. I also want to express my great sympathy for your collective efforts to keep serious philosophical reflection alive in Iran under what must be politically difficult circumstances. It is so impressive that, however difficult may be the domestic political situation, you are able to continue with the work of pursuing philosophical communication and philosophical understanding, and keeping alive this very important element of your culture. Now, the topic of the conference is the relation between ethics and peace. And one thing that I would like to say, which really expresses my own point of view and may be something that some of you don't agree with, is that individual ethics and individual morality is not the key to furthering peace in the world. Peace, of course, depends on the relations between nations or nations and other groups that may have access to armed force, some of which are not nation states. And it's my belief that although there is a sense in which ethics is a very important condition and determinant as to whether peace is or is not possible between such groups with military capacity. It is the ethics embodied in institutions that really matters, rather than the individual ethics of particular men and women. Of course, it is individuals who support institutions, and ultimately the institutions have the ethical character that they have only because they are followed by and created by individuals. But in this domain, the domain of war and peace, as in a number of other domains, the protection of individual rights, social justice, these being among the most important ethical questions, the only way to achieve them is to embody certain ethical values in institutions, the institutions of law, the institutions of economics and taxation, and in the case of war and peace, the institutions of government that determine how decisions to use armed force are made. And this is not within the purview or the power of individuals, except very indirectly. I want to remind you of something with which you are probably all familiar, that Immanuel Kant, in his famous essay, Perpetual Peace, predicted that if the government of more and more countries became what he called republican, by which he meant really representative democracies of some kind, that this would result in a growth of peace, because democratic governments would be reluctant to go to war with one another. That it was much easier for a government that was entirely controlled by one individual or a small aristocratic group or an oligarchy of some kind to decide to go to war, thus placing the lives of all of their citizens at risk. It was much easier for an autocracy to make a decision to go to war than for a democracy, which depends on the will of the people. And by and large, although at the time that he wrote, I think there was only one government, namely the Swiss, that satisfied his condition of being republican. Since then, as democracies have become more and more common in the world, his prediction has been borne out. There have been many wars, but they have all involved at least one party that was not a democracy. The democracies have been engaged in many of these wars, but never against one another. Now, perhaps there are some exceptions to this, but it is an interesting fact and a remarkable tribute to Immanuel Kant's insight that history seems to have borne him out. The reason for this is that if the decision to go to war has to pass democratic approval, it brings into play the evident direct interest that the people who are the populations of these governments have in avoiding conflict and in finding, even if there are, avoiding violent conflict and finding, even if there are differences between the nations involved, some method of accommodation or compromise. And we see this, in fact, in the present situation between the United States and Iran. I mean, Iran is not a democracy, but it is clear that its population, like the population of the United States, is resistant to escalation. And in the United States, which is a democracy, what has led to the danger of war is precisely the autocratic character of the present administration. I mean, the president has taken military action against Iran through the assassination of the head of the Al-Quds force, without seeking the approval of the democratic parts of the government, the legislature. And there is at present a conflict between the executive and the legislature over where the authority, where the war-making authority lies. And this is a very important domestic individual American struggle. Now, what this means for the theoretical topic that is the topic of this conference is that it's not just ethics that is in play in determining the likelihood of violent conflict between nations. It is very importantly whether the institutions that determine decisions about military action are sufficiently connected with the will of the people so that the self-interest of the many people who make up the society can express itself in determining whether military action is justified. And that's why representative government of some democratic kind is so important in reducing the likelihood of military conflict. There's another respect in which ethics is not necessarily the key to the question. Ethical conflict itself can be a source of very serious disagreement between nations. Sometimes this is connected with religious differences, as we see in the present situation in the world. But it isn't only religious differences that produce severe ethical conflict between nations. The Cold War was a conflict based on a radical difference between two conceptions of political legitimacy and social justice. And there too, it created conflicts that produced the threat of extreme military conflict. I mean, fortunately, the world managed to escape a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that conflict between communism and liberal democratic capitalism is no longer one of the big ethical oppositions in the world. But we can see that ethics can be as much a source of conflict between nations as of agreement. And this leads me actually to the point with which I want to close. I want to close with a question, which I think is a very difficult and important question of political theory for our time. It is this: how much ethical and political pluralism among conflicting conceptions of the good life and the good society, how much difference and pluralism among the nations of the world of this kind is compatible with secure world peace? Can we have peace between nations, that a secure peace between nations that are governed by radically different and inconsistent conceptions of political ethics and also individual ethics? To put it another way, can we hope for secure peace in the world only as there comes to be convergence across international boundaries on a common ethical and political outlook? I think this is a difficult question. It's partly an empirical question, but it's also a question of what kinds of grounds are needed to secure the abstention by nations who disagree with one another on some matters from the use of military force to further their conception of right and wrong. This is also, of course, a question about domestic peace. And there too, it isn't self-evident what the answer is. The question being how much ethical and religious pluralism within a nation state is compatible with domestic peace and the willingness of all parties to abide by legal methods for settling their differences without resort to violence. But at least it is part of the liberal political tradition of which I am a member, that a good deal of pluralism and disagreement within a nation can be contained in institutions that guarantee the individual rights and the freedom of, for example, religious practice of everyone, so that domestically social peace is compatible with a certain amount of pluralism. And this has been shown to work, at least in some countries, in some circumstances. But when we extend this question to the global scale, it becomes much harder, it seems to me. And so the question is a serious one. Do we need, what degree of convergence on a common set of values do we need at the international scale to support a stable and enduring peace among nations? And with that question, I leave you and take my leave and wish you all well in the consideration of your of the questions you're going to be discussing at this conference. Thank you.